Welcome to this video, which is going to go through Unit 6.3, which is all about policies towards the Jews in World War II. Before we begin looking at the policies during the second half of World War II, we're just going to quickly go through some key events from Unit 5. If you want to skip over the next few slides because you know it well, that's absolutely fine. So key events, obviously the Nazis come to power at the end of January 1933, and they start this escalation of anti-Semitic policies almost immediately, beginning with the boycott of Jewish shops, which was supposed to be long-lasting, but actually only lasted for one day. The Nazis then introduced things like the law for the restoration of the professional civil service, which basically required Jews to be dismissed, but wasn't fully effective because there were people that were exempt from this. There were similar laws as well for other professions, as well as the civil service. There were also things like laws trying to exclude doctors and lawyers as well. And in total, over the 12 years of Nazi rule, there were 400 different laws and decrees that targeted Jewish people. They then tried to limit the amount of Jewish children at university in April 1933, and then they passed things like the Reich Press Law in October 1933, which was about applying strict censorship to close down any publications they disliked, and they were also doing things like sacking Jewish editors there as well. As a result of these measures, by the end of 1933, 37,000 of the 500,000 Jews that lived in Germany had left. Most stayed behind though because they had no idea how bad things would get. In September 1935, things got worse for Jewish people when they introduced the Nuremberg laws. Now there were two official laws here, but after this was passed, there were lots of local businesses that pursued their own Nuremberg-style laws, and they basically tried to ban Jews from certain areas. In 1936, there was a bit of an easing of anti-Jewish measures with the Olympics going on, which the Nazis didn't want to highlight their anti-Semitic policies at that point. The Nazis' policies escalated between 1938 and 1939. First of all, with the Anschluss with Austria, which expanded their so-called Jewish problem by giving them another 180,000 Jews. And those Jews there had to deal with horrendous anti-Semitic policies that caught up with 5 years of German legislation in just 5 days. It then accelerated the economic persecution of Jews as well. In April 1938, there was a decree for the registration of Jewish property that basically allowed the confiscation of the majority of Jewish homes. It started the Aryanization of property, and it also closed down a lot of businesses as well. Out of the 40,000 businesses, only 8,000 Jewish businesses left by 1939. Now, this policy of Anschluss with Austria also led to some new policies of emigration. Adolf Eichmann oversaw the new Central Office for Jewish Emigration, which was created in Vienna. Within 6 months, he had forced 45,000 Austrian Jews to emigrate. And at this point, it's basically seen as emigration being the so-called solution to the Jewish problem. We can see that that then is extended later on as well in 1939, when they then create a new office called the Reich Office for Jewish Emigration, which basically is now about establishing emigration from both Germany and Austria as well. Meanwhile, in Germany, there are things that are changing in terms of the policies towards the Jews. It becomes much more about violence rather than just about discrimination in November 1938 with the key event of Kristallnacht. Now, remember, that is an event where 91 Jewish people are killed, 30,000 sent to concentration camps for the first time, and that is a real turning point in Nazi policy. Goering also talked about now the gloves are off after that event, and he passed the decree for excluding Jews from economic life, which meant that all those remaining 8,000 Jewish businesses were to be shut down and Jews were forbidden to seek work from a non-Jew. Things got even worse for Jewish people in September 1939 with the invasion of Poland. As a result of this, they wanted to use the general government area controlled by Hans Frank as a dumping ground for the Jews and basically separate them from the rest of the population. So still at this point, very much a policy of emigration. As you know, the war leads to the radicalization of the state. And we can see that they are thinking in more radical terms, but still thinking about a policy of emigration at this point between 1940 and 1941. So in the late summer and early autumn of 1940, the Nazis started thinking about something called the Madagascar Plan. This was after Hans Frank, the person that was in charge of the general government area of Poland, had basically complained that there were too many Jews in that area and he couldn't resettle them all there. So they then planned to send 4 million Jews to Madagascar, and they knew that a lot of those Jews would die as a result of those conditions. So for a few historians only, they might see that as the start of the final solution. Basically this idea that a plan to kill Jewish people was fixed, even if the location was not. After the Madagascar plan was proved that it couldn't be effective because they weren't able to defeat who they wanted to defeat, they then decided that they were going to send Jews to Siberia instead. So remember that they have the plans to invade the Soviet Union, which they do from June 1941. They think that's going to be a very quick victory and that they'll then be able to send those Jews to Siberia instead. However, both of these plans were then eventually abandoned due to military failures. In February of 1940, we also have the first ghetto in Lodz, which is closed off and therefore different to the sort of reservation that we have in Lublin, which has been created before that. In October 1940, we have the largest of the ghettos established at Warsaw, and in this tiny area, you have 400,000 Jews in this one ghetto alone. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 completely changes the treatment of Jews in all of the different locations because it is a war of racial annihilation and is fought with a savagery and ideological intensity that is different from that of the West. Now, the treatment of these Eastern Jews is unbelievably awful, and it marks a shift to mass murder, which would then be applied to Western Jews as well later on. Now we can see that evidence of mass murder through the Einsatzgruppen, who killed over 500,000 people between June and July 1941. And it's estimated that the Einsatzgruppen in total, out of the 6 million Jews that died, over 1 million of them were killed by the Einsatzgruppen, either through mass shootings or through the use of mobile gas vans. Here's one example of an Einsatzgruppen mass murder: 30,000 people killed in just 2 days. That's men, women, and children. We've now had a recap of the background to this video. This video is going to talk about what happens from 1942 onwards and the so-called final solution to the so-called Jewish problem. Now, just a reminder that you have your Cornell grid, which you can look at if you want to during the video, and you've also got your short answer test. Both of these are good revision materials to use to support you with this video. So we're now thinking about the final solution itself and this last phase of Nazi policies towards the Jews. Now, it's important to understand that the final solution is the plan to systematically exterminate the Jewish population of Europe. Before this point, there had been a lot of very confused and uncontrolled actions. There had been a mix of deportations and ghettoization. There had been plans with things like the Madagascar plan and the Siberia plan as well. But overcrowding in ghettos and logistical challenges led to a search for a so-called final solution to their problem. It's not exactly clear when that final decision was made. We do know that in November 1941, Heydrich invited senior officials from several agencies to a Berlin suburb of Wannsee to discuss these matters. Now, he doesn't actually plan that meeting to happen until December, but then it is delayed and doesn't happen until January 1942. Hence why a lot of people say that the decision was made right at the end of 1941. Now, as a result of this plan, the Nazis then became a bureaucratic killing machine, and they were able to murder so many Jewish people. But also, as well as those 6 million Jews that die, there are also millions of other victims. There's 11 million total victims of Nazi aggression during World War II and before, and that includes Soviet prisoners of war, Romani and Sinti people, and obviously disabled people from 1939 as well. Even when they faced defeat in 1944, when the situation of the war felt hopeless to them, they actually accelerated the killings rather than, turning their resources to actually winning the war. If we think about that in a little bit more detail, from 1944, they were even doing things like sending the Jewish population from places like Italy and France, Greece, Slovakia, all rounded up for deportation to these extermination camps. It's only in November 1944, when the Soviet army had advanced deep into Poland, that the Nazis actually tried to close down this killing machine and conceal what they had done. But obviously their efforts of concealment were futile. A key event that you really need to know about is the Wannsee Conference, which happens on the 20th of January 1942. Now, this was a meeting that was chaired by Heydrich. It was a meeting that involved 15 Nazis that you can see pictured here, and as you'll notice, Hitler and Himmler don't attend. It's chaired by Heydrich, who has received orders from Goering, empowering him to organise the preparations for the final solution. Some historians believe that Heydrich actually received an unwritten order from Hitler, while others think that he was actually acting on his own initiative to try and enhance his own power and authority. Regardless of which situation it was, whether it was a formal order from Hitler or not, what they were doing during this meeting is basically coordinating the implementation of the final solution. They were making sure that they clarified the roles of various government departments to make sure that the operation ran smoothly. Remember, this is not when the decision is made, it's already taken before that meeting, but here they're basically discussing how they are going to implement it. So the meeting ensured bureaucratic cooperation and making sure that everybody knew what their roles were, and deportations were now directed to specific extermination camps. Now, this was a really key event, really, really important, because obviously after this, the mass killings accelerated significantly. They'd already had the Einsatzgruppen who had been going to areas in the east and coordinating mass shootings, but now this is turning into industrial process. This was now about creating new death camps in order to be able to murder as many people as efficiently as possible. And over half of the Holocaust victims, the 6 million Jews that were killed, were murdered between February 1942 and February 1943. It's important that you have your own ideas about when the final solution started in your own mind. Let's just have a quick look at some historians' views to see where you fit. So historians like Goldhagen, Farmer and Kershaw have said that the Wannsee Conference was only about finalising the strategies for an already operational policy, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Farmer suggests that the Wannsee Conference therefore marks the moment of endorsement by a broad cross-section of the German government. In this sense, after this event, the genocide was coordinated, systematic and bureaucratised as well. So it's up to you about whether you're going to argue that the Wannsee Conference was the start of the final solution, whether you are going to say that it was created earlier, or whether you're going to even consider that actually things like the Madagascar Plan were part of the so-called final solution. I just want to start by emphasising how important this decision and this conference was. You can see in this map here the consequences of the Wannsee Conference, the fact that there are so many Jewish people killed, and you can see the breakdown of that 6 million by country on this map. So for instance, you can see that 2.8 million Polish Jews were killed, 1.3 million Soviet Jews were killed as well. We're now going to go through a timeline of the camps, the latter of which are known as Operation Reinhard. Now, these are different, remember, to the concentration camps that had been around since 1933, since March 1933 with Dachau. These are camps that are built with the primary aim of extermination. So we're going to talk about these different ones and some different statistics. You're not expected to remember all of these statistics. And just a quick note that these are different to the Cornell grid ones, but these ones here are from the AQA textbook, so they're the ones that the examiners will expect you to know, or at least know a couple of them. So if we start off with the first camp that we need to know about, which is Chelmno, which opened in December 1941. So as you can see, before the Wannsee Conference even happened. Now, this was a place where 145,000 people are estimated to have been murdered there, mostly Jews from the Lodz ghetto, as well as Roma and Sinti people as well. Because this was earlier on and they hadn't coordinated gas in the same way, this was primarily using gas fans rather than gas chambers, which they used later on. The next camp that you need to know about opened in March 1942, and this is Belzec. Now, this was where they started using stationary gas chambers, and it becomes part of Operation Reinhard after May 1942, which is what it's named when they're opening these camps after Heydrich had been assassinated. This particular camp is estimated to have killed almost 500,000 people, mostly Jews. The next one that opens is Sobibor. This opens in late April 1942, and it's estimated that up to 250,000 people died here, mainly Jews deported from Poland and the Netherlands. Now, this is an important place. We're going to talk about this later on when we look at resistance, because it is the site of an uprising in October 1943, in which 800 prisoners escaped. It was closed down shortly afterwards by Himmler. The next one that opens is Treblinka. Now, Treblinka is the second largest killing centre after Auschwitz, and it's estimated that 870,000 people died there. Majority of those victims were from the Warsaw Ghetto. The camp was destroyed after a prisoner revolt in August 1943. The next one that opens is Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, it already existed before this as a concentration camp, but it opened as an extermination camp in early 1942. This was a place where they weren't just using carbon monoxide, but they were actually using Zyklon B gas as well here. It's estimated that there were 1.1 million deaths in this location alone, 1 million Jews, but also lots of Roma, Poles and Soviet prisoners of war. A fifth of all the Jewish victims were killed here. It is a really important killing centre, and obviously so awful for the deaths of those 1.1 million, but it wasn't just an extermination camp. It was actually a camp that was used as a labour camp, concentration camp, and it actually made a lot of munitions for the Second World War as well. However, it was primarily used as the site of the final solution from 1943. Another one to be aware of as well is Majdanek. This technically opened in October 1941, but it began to be used for extermination and as part of the final solution from 1942. This was a place where there are around 200,000 people that were killed, and it functioned like Auschwitz as both a labour and extermination camp as well. So you might have seen this before, this formation of these camps known as Operation Reinhard. This is basically named after Reinhard Heydrich and named in his honour because obviously he had been the chairman of the Wannsee Conference and was then assassinated. So they wanted to create these death camps in his honour. We've just looked at some statistics of how many people died in those camps, but it's also really important to think about the human experience, and you could get some sources on this as well in the exam potentially. So the journey to these camps was horrendous. You can see the kinds of transport that they were put into from these pictures here, basically these cattle trucks. Now, the responsibility for the clearing out of the ghettos that had been their main policy up to this point was generally with the SS, but they did ask for help from the Jewish councils who had to try and find people for so-called resettlement. Thousands of Jews were rounded up in these ghettos daily and then put on cattle trucks like this and transported to places like Auschwitz. Most of the earlier victims were from the East, for instance, Polish Jews, but by the spring of 1942, Jews from all over the German Empire were sent to these camps. And remember, by the time we get to 1942, we've got a significant number of these camps. It's no longer just one. The transportation experience was horrific for these people. Families were usually separated, and about 150 people were crammed into these closed freight cars without food, water, or toilet facilities. Once they arrived at the camps, the authorities aimed to kill all but a few of the deportees within 2 hours. In Treblinka, it was 90% of people that were killed within 2 hours of arriving. We're now going to think a little bit about their experience when they arrived at these different locations. Now we're thinking here about Auschwitz in particular. Now Auschwitz had obviously a labour camp as well, and therefore there were more survivors, at least temporarily, after the selection process. We just mentioned about Treblinka that 90% of people there were killed within 2 hours. At Auschwitz it was slightly different. Now, because they had that labour camp as well, approximately 30% of people were selected to work. Anybody that looked fit and healthy enough after being in the ghettos to be able to carry out that work for them. Generally, people were separated, so men and women separated and herded into barracks to undress. Women and girls had their heads shaved. They told them it was to stop lice, but in reality, they used their hair for making socks for U-boat crews. They were then taken to buildings signed baths, and victims were then pushed into the gas chambers. Auschwitz itself had 6 gas chambers. Now, at first, victims were then buried in enormous burial ditches, but as the scale of the Holocaust grew, the Nazis couldn't keep up with this, and they moved on to cremation. Auschwitz itself had 14 ovens, which cremated up to 8,000 people a day. Another key area to know about is the death marches. Now, this is essentially when they evacuated the extermination camps. They did this for a few different reasons. The first one is that as we have advancing troops, for instance, the Soviet army, the SS authorities did not want prisoners to fall into those enemy hands alive. They didn't want people telling stories to their Soviet or Allied liberators about their experiences. The SS also thought that they needed prisoners to maintain production of armaments wherever possible, and so therefore they wanted them alive and with them if they could. And for some SS leaders, including Himmler, they believed that they could use Jewish concentration camp prisoners as hostages to bargain for a separate peace in the West that would guarantee the survival of the Nazi regime. So that's why they emptied these camps of their prisoners. Now, in the summer and early autumn months of 1944, they had some evacuations that were carried out by train, or in the case of German positions cut off in the Baltic states, by ship. As winter approached and the Allies reached the German borders and assumed full control of German skies, SS authorities increasingly evacuated concentration camp prisoners from both east and west on foot, and that's what you can see in these pictures here. So as Soviet forces advanced, camps were then evacuated, and the majority of people were doing this on foot from the winter of 1944. Now remember, these people have been in extermination camps for a couple of years. They were extremely malnourished and ill and poorly clothed and not ready to deal with that harsh winter. The guards shot those who couldn't keep up, and there were a lot of people that died as a result. It's estimated that between 250,000 and 400,000 people died during these marches, whether it was from illness or from being shot by these SS officers. Now, after this, they did manage to liberate a lot of these victims of the death marches. But all of those victims that had died, they wanted the German population to be confronted with the horror of what had happened. So they actually often required German civilians in local areas to view the exhumed bodies of those who had died during the death marches to show them what the Nazis had been responsible for. Now moving on to Jewish resistance. Now, it's really important if you're ever talking about anything like resistance that you know how you're going to define it, because how you define it will affect the scale of resistance you believe in. Just like when it comes to things like the Golden Age, it's important that you define the Golden Age to be able to assess to what extent it was one. Now, you do not have to agree with this definition in pink. I need you to have your own definition that you're going to know in your own words. But in terms of how I would view resistance, I wouldn't talk about it just being about something as small as armed resistance. I would think about any action, whether it is violent or non-violent, organised or individual, where essentially Jewish people sought to oppose or undermine or survive or even assert human dignity against Nazi persecution and genocide. Now that's quite wordy, so try and come up with your own definition that's maybe a little bit shorter. Now, regardless of how you define Jewish resistance, it is a really complicated topic. There are some quite outrageous claims that come from some historians that we'll look at in a second about the fact that there wasn't really any Jewish resistance, and I think that that's quite harsh. So there have been some historians and some people who have suggested and gone as far as saying Jewish people were responsible for the Holocaust to some extent by not offering more in the way of resistance. If we look at some historians' views then, so if we look at Hilberg first of all, he suggested that by complying with Nazi decrees, the Jews essentially sealed their own fate. And Hannah Arendt talked about how Jewish leaders collaborated with the Germans and therefore had a role in exterminating their own people. She suggested without their help, the Germans wouldn't have been able to kill as many Jews. However, I personally think that their views are really harsh. It was an impossible situation for those Jewish council leaders. They felt that any sort of resistance was tantamount to mass suicide, and they hoped that German policy would change as well. Most Jews were also killed as well before they even had a chance to build any effective resistance networks. They also lacked arms and outside support from other people, and there was a significant threat of reprisals as well. So if we think about an example in 1942, there was a young Jewish deportee who attacked a Ukrainian guard with a dagger. The result of this was that a trainload of deportees was then immediately machine gunned. So for a lot of people, they were reluctant to carry out any violence against the Nazis because they knew more of their own people would die in brutal ways afterwards. Personally, I would argue that there was fairly extensive Jewish resistance, and the Nazis went to great lengths to conceal this. Though how much resistance there is going to depend on how you define it, and so it's up to you whether you're going to use my wider definition and therefore suggest that there was quite extensive resistance, or whether you were going to have a different definition and suggest it was more limited. It is true, regardless of how you're defining, that Jewish resistance could only ever be small scale and had no chance really of any lasting success. However, that doesn't obscure the fact that it was there. For instance, if we think in Eastern Europe, there were partisan fighters like the Bilski group, who are shown in the film Defiance, if you're interested in watching that, that carried out acts of sabotage against the German forces. They were doing things like blowing up rail lines and also shooting collaborators of the Germans as well. There were 10,000 Jewish partisans that were active in Lithuania alone in early 1942, which shows a significant scale of resistance there as well. Hans Frank, the governor of the general government area of Poland, even committed large forces to deal with this so-called problem, which shows the fact that the Nazis did view this as effective resistance. There were also some sporadic revolts in the ghettos as well, including places like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising that we'll come back to in a second. And there were also some organised revolts in the camps as well. For instance, in Sobibor, there were 800 prisoners who escaped and the camp was closed afterwards, and also Treblinka, where the camp was destroyed. It's important that you can talk about some examples of Jewish resistance in a bit more detail. So let's go through some of them then. The first one that I really want you to know about is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. Now remember that the Warsaw Ghetto was the largest of all the ghettos and had over 400,000 people in that one location. Now, there were only 60,000 people left in that ghetto by April 1943. And there were a lot of rumours that were going around about the fact that they weren't actually being resettled in the east like they had thought they were at the start. Instead, there were a lot of rumours that people had been sent to Treblinka extermination camp. And therefore, they knew they only had a limited amount of time until they too were killed at one of these extermination camps. So this event started when German troops moved to do the final liquidation of the ghetto. They didn't have very much in terms of resources, and remember they're fighting against a well-equipped German army, but they did manage to arm themselves with a handful of pistols, 17 rifles, and lots of Molotov cocktails. But they were facing more than 2,000 heavily armed and well-trained German troops that were supported by things like tanks and flamethrowers. So they knew from the beginning that they weren't going to win this, but they wanted to put up a significant fight. Now, during this event that takes place over a month, approximately 13,000 Jews were killed, and another 6,000 Jews were then burned alive or died from smoke inhalation during the burning of the ghetto. Essentially, when the Nazis couldn't defeat them, they decided to just burn down the ghetto, and that's how they effectively ended this revolt. Those people that fought had no illusions about the final outcome. They knew that they were going to be killed, but they wanted to take as many Nazis down as possible. They were only managed to kill 16 Nazis during this event, though. Now, even though the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was not really very successful, it was a crucial event and shows the efforts of Jewish resistance. It was the first time in all of German-occupied Europe that there was any kind of organised uprising against the Nazis. And word did spread about this, and it set a climate of the fact that they should have some more effective Jewish resistance, and that led to some of the revolts in the camps as well. Now, it's important to know that this isn't the only ghetto-based revolt. There's another one, for instance, in Krakow, but basically these events tended to only happen when Jews had lost any illusions about the chance of surviving. It's more about a gesture of defiance than a survival strategy. It's also a good idea to know about at least one example of resistance in the camps as well. Now, before we go through the examples, it's important to remember that successful armed resistance in the camps was virtually impossible. Most of these camp inmates had come from ghettos previously, and then obviously the terrible conditions in the extermination camps also weakened them severely as well. They were dealing with disease and starvation and were generally exhausted. They also found it very difficult to be able to organise opposition, as it was so difficult to get weapons, and also they couldn't necessarily trust their fellow inmates. Because of the fear of reprisals, a lot of people were very, very scared of getting involved in any kind of armed resistance, and therefore they could only really have effective opposition if they had large numbers of people on their side, but that was really difficult to achieve. So there are a few different examples that you could know about for resistance in the camps. You only really need to know one example to be able to use it. For example, you could remember about what happened in Treblinka. Remember that in Treblinka in August 1943, the camp was destroyed after a prisoner revolt. 180 of their work Jews managed to break out, but the majority of them were tracked down and executed afterwards. Or you could try and remember about the Sobibor uprising in October 1943. This was one where 800 prisoners managed to escape and they killed 13 Nazi guards. Now, obviously, a lot of those people were then hunted down and killed by the Nazis shortly afterwards, but 70 of those 800 people successfully survived the war. And after this event, Himmler closed down that camp. Depending on how wide your definition of resistance is, you could also include some examples of Jewish subversion, essentially where they are undermining Nazi policies. So they don't all have to be examples of armed resistance. You could also think about how people were doing things like trying to escape from the Nazis and going into hiding. So up until mid-1944, about 40,000 Jews had survived in Poland in hiding or in disguise. And that's an example of people resisting in their own way. There's also things like spiritual resistance as well, where people are basically trying to retain their dignity and their culture and those Jewish traditions. And there's examples of people doing that still in the ghettos and also in the extermination camps as well. Even doing things like keeping important Jewish works hidden, that was another way of trying to basically resist the Nazis. Doing things like keeping records of what the Nazis did, even with things like artwork in the camps as well, was again about trying to make sure that they were retaining knowledge about what happened and stopping the Nazis from achieving what they wanted of wiping out all memory of the Jews. We're now going to go through the final bit of this unit, which is about who is ultimately responsible for the Holocaust. Now, on this slide here, you can see the names of lots of groups of people or individuals. It's up to you how important you think these different people are. You were given lots of notes on them in lesson, but I'm going to go through the key things that I would expect you to know over the next few slides. You might want to make a spider diagram of all these different people and their roles as we go through. So we're now going to think about Hitler's role in the Holocaust, and you need to think about your own views about to what extent you would say Hitler's responsible. Obviously, we want to think about the fact that Hitler did have a key role in the Holocaust. As the Führer, as the supreme leader, ultimately he had the final say on all policies. I want you to remember as well that obviously Hitler was a fanatical anti-Semite. We can see that in things like his Mein Kampf autobiography written in 1923, and also even things like the 25-point programme from 1920 as well. Now, there are some people that suggest that obviously Hitler was important for the Holocaust. I don't think anyone is going to be denying that. But there are historians that suggest that he didn't actually know all the intricate details of the Holocaust and wasn't necessarily providing that to the leading Nazis. So, for instance, Kershaw supports this idea because he talked about Hitler's role was more authorizing than directing. There's this idea that people in the Nazi state were working towards the Führer, and therefore people were coming up with plans, then presenting them to him, and he was authorizing those plans, rather than actually driving the anti-Semitic policy. Now, there are some times when Hitler rejects the most extreme anti-Semitic measures. For instance, in 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, he technically picked two of the most moderate laws, but that's probably due to him not feeling confident enough to go for really extreme measures in 1935. Obviously, technically, he'd consolidated his power and he was the dictator of Germany at that point, but it was still fairly early on into Nazi rule, and therefore he might not have wanted to have tested the waters and gone that far that early on. Certainly true, though, that Hitler had talked from the very beginning, certainly in individual speeches, about things like the killing of Jewish people. He'd done that even back in his autobiography in 1923. And he does it again in 1939 in a speech where he talks about wanting the annihilation of the Jewish race. And he talks about things like the outbreak of war mixed in with that. So it's absolutely true that Hitler supported the Holocaust. We don't want to deny that. But it is important to be aware that a lot of historians say he didn't provide those individual details and wasn't necessarily the driving force behind those specific policies. Nevertheless, it was still his vision that they were working towards. And as Kershaw also argued, he was the inspiration behind the final solution. If people like Himmler and Heydrich acted outside his orders, he would have got rid of them, like he did with Röhm when he threatened him. So Hitler clearly at least supported those policies, even if he wasn't necessarily directing and coming up with those policies. As the historian Maris has said, no Hitler, no Holocaust. So Hitler was incredibly important to the Holocaust, but it is important to remember that he couldn't have been solely responsible because he couldn't have carried out the Holocaust without his bureaucrats or functionaries, and they wouldn't have done it without Hitler. So it's very much interconnected. Hitler needed to provide that authorization and that idea of working towards him and what people thought he would like, but ultimately he couldn't have done this by himself. He needed support from people that were going to carry it out for him. It's also important to think about the role of high-ranking Nazis as well. Now, obviously, there are a lot of them to talk about, and you wouldn't have to mention all of them in an exam answer. If we think about people like Goebbels, now obviously Goebbels has had a long-term role in the final solution and has a lot of responsibility for the Holocaust because he was in charge of propaganda and he was therefore responsible for conditioning people into accepting and performing the genocide. Obviously, there are people that don't respond to the measures that escalate over time, like the boycotts, the Nuremberg laws, even things like the Night of Broken Glass in 1938. And there are some people that argue that the propaganda was really effective and therefore that's why people didn't stand up. Other people support the Germans and say actually it wasn't necessarily they were receptive to Goebbels' propaganda that was anti-Semitic, but actually it might have been more down to the terror state. Nevertheless, there were a lot of people in Germany that genuinely believed that enemies had to be destroyed to ensure survival, particularly with the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Goebbels did provide that idea that Jews were a threat, and that was believed by certainly some of the German population. We can also think about the responsibility of people like Goering as well. Now, obviously, Goering was really responsible for the economic destruction of German businesses and for all of the horrendous things that happened after the Night of Broken Glass. But he also is the person that sends the order to Heydrich requesting a complete solution to the Jewish problem that then leads to Heydrich organising the Wannsee Conference, which happens in January 1942. You could also think about people like Adolf Eichmann as well. Eichmann acted on his own initiative and began transporting Jews as well. Hitler had actually told him to wait. And the fact that he then had actually sent a lot of Jews to the general government area, then put pressure on that area and made them think that they needed a final solution to the so-called Jewish problem because deportations were becoming basically too messy and chaotic. So some people say his role made murder inevitable, and also when it comes to actually acting out the final solution, he is also responsible for the transportation of a lot of people to these extermination camps. And as a result of that, he is executed after the war, after he's put on trial in Israel. So essentially, you could talk about people that supported propaganda, logistics, and labour, people like Goebbels, Goering, Eichmann. They were all people that you could discuss. You could also talk about people like Heydrich and Himmler. So if you're going to do a paragraph on Heydrich, obviously you could talk about how he organised the Wannsee Conference and talk about the importance of that. You could also discuss Himmler as well. Obviously, Himmler, his boss, he was ultimately in charge of all of the terror state in Germany. By 1937, the SS, which he was in charge of, was increasingly asserting their claim to have a major role in the formation of Jewish policy, and therefore Himmler himself has some responsibility for the Holocaust. The SS were the people that were responsible for managing those death camps, and Himmler turned Auschwitz into the main extermination camp. So that's why some historians think about Himmler being absolutely essential for genocide. For instance, Breitman said Himmler was an architect of genocide. Himmler also trained Heydrich, who coordinated Operation Reinhard, which was only called that after his death, which was essentially carrying out the final solution through those extermination camps. Now, it's important to be aware that Himmler's ideas were not original. For instance, when he was using gas in these extermination camps, he was actually using things that had been already tested in the T4 program, where they had been gassing disabled men, women, and children. So he wasn't necessarily coming up with any new ideas, but he certainly helped to implement the Holocaust. also think about functionaries, and you can talk about these together or separately. Functionaries are essentially people that have helped support the Holocaust, that helped to carry it out, and without them, they wouldn't have actually been able to put those directives into practice. So, for instance, you could talk about the Einsatzgruppen, which you should remember from Unit 5. Remember, they're responsible for carrying out mass murder in places like the Soviet Union and the East. And remember that they kill over 1 million people through mass shootings or the use of mobile gas vans. There's an example in Babi Yar, which is where they kill 30,000 people in 2 days, which shows you the support that they had from groups like the Einsatzgruppen, because they clearly were dedicated enough to carry out mass murder in a really short time period. Now, some of the Einsatzgruppen post-war argued that they were just following orders. However, there's been a lot of research into it and found that actually there were no repercussions for people that said that they didn't want to participate, which suggests that they were only too willing to participate, often thinking that it would lead to greater promotions for them after the events of the Holocaust. It's important to also note with the Einsatzgruppen that some of them were joining as fanatical Nazis, but actually some of the people that carried out the Einsatzgruppen mass shootings were actually just ordinary people, often policemen, and these weren't fanatical groups. So their actions were absolutely crucial in the Holocaust because they encouraged groups like the Wehrmacht, to commit the atrocities that they did, and also obviously they carried out the executions of over 1 million people themselves as well. You can also think about functionaries like the Wehrmacht, the army as well. So, for instance, we think about a speech that Hitler made in May 1944, where he talked about fulfilling his prophecy of making Europe Jew-free. Hitler's generals generally applauded that, which suggests an affinity between the army and Nazi leadership. The army generally supported these ideas of making Europe Jew-free, as they saw a link between Judaism and Bolshevism, particularly in the East. Now, the army also participated in the killing of civilians. They murdered 500,000 Soviet prisoners of war, participated in economic exploitation, which led to death, and committed unauthorized acts of plunder, rape, and pillage. But this isn't just against Jewish victims, but also other people as well, but still suggests that they did play, to some extent, a role in the Holocaust and the horror of genocide generally. However, you could argue that the army were not actually that crucial when it comes to the Holocaust, because they were carrying out a lot of this against people that weren't actually Jewish, but also they did have ultimately to listen to what Hitler wanted them to do, because Hitler did have absolute power over the armed forces, certainly by the end of the war. Another key group is the German people. Now, this one's a lot more debated. There is a lot more contention about to what extent German civilians are actually to blame for the Holocaust. They certainly argued after the war that they didn't know what was going on and there was nothing that they could do to stop it. And it is true that the final solution was supposed to be done in secret, hence as well why these death camps are created in places like Poland rather than in Germany itself. They were also told that Jews were going to be deported for resettlement and for labour, but it is true as well that there were a lot of rumours about what was happening, and that if people didn't know, it was probably because they chose not to find out any more details about it, because it would have been dangerous to know that anyway. So let's have a little look at some ideas about how they may have been responsible for the Holocaust, even if it's less than other groups. Historians like Hilberg have said that decisions of Nazi leaders had to be accepted and implemented to be successful, and that required ordinary people to participate in the Holocaust, people like civil servants and people like train drivers as well. Now, Goldhung goes even further and is a very controversial historian, but talked in his book about Hitler's willing executioners. He basically talked about how some of them were fanatical anti-Semites that wanted to get rid of Jews and therefore supported the Holocaust. Now, it is true that there were some Germans who were anti-Semites. For instance, some had participated in things like the burning of the 250 synagogues during the Night of Broken Glass in 1938. And some Germans did actively participate in the destruction of Jewish people, for instance, denouncing Jews that were in hiding. However, it's very difficult to argue that there was fanatical anti-Semitism from a whole population, and there isn't really enough evidence to support that. There were small pockets of people that were, extremely anti-Semitic, but most people were kind of acting more out of apathy than out of extreme anti-Semitism. So this is supported by the historian Kershaw, who suggests that the road to Auschwitz was made by hatred, but paved by apathy. So this sort of idea of the historian Kershaw even suggested that the road to Auschwitz was made by hatred but paved by apathy. So basically thinking about this idea that a lot of Germans just didn't respond very much to events like Kristallnacht, which encouraged the regime to think that they could go much further. So it's perhaps more accurate to describe the German people not as necessarily responsible for the Holocaust, but quite apathetic to it and unintentionally encouraging the Nazis as a result. For instance, Barkay argues that most Germans didn't object to Nazi policy pre-war. The only debate is actually whether they were indifferent, passive, or complicit, essentially, in the Holocaust. Puker talks about the fact that they retreated into their own private sphere in the face of the terror state, and therefore that's why they didn't organise any opposition to the Holocaust, rather than being fanatical anti-Semites. The lack of outcry could also be attributed to things like terror and worry of reprisals, or it could be that they were too focused on their own situation of the hardship of war. So it is quite a complicated group to think about, and it's worth pausing the video here to think about your own views on to what extent the German people are responsible for the Holocaust. Is it a group that you would even put about in an exam answer, or is it a group that you wouldn't focus on as much? So we've got to the end of the main content of this unit, but it is really important that you pause here and you think about which side of the historiography you fall on, which side of the historiographical debate do you agree with. It's really important that you think about who is responsible for the Holocaust, but also that you think about when did the final solution begin. So if we just talk through it and then you pause afterwards and you'll be able to write down your own ideas. So there are two major schools of thought. The first one is the intentionists. Now, they would generally argue that Hitler was absolutely key to the final solution. Extreme intentionists like Fleming and Daubowitz see Hitler as committing to extermination of the Jews at a very early stage in his political career. They talk about how there was a gradualist policy going from persecution to Auschwitz. Basically, that Hitler was testing the waters with things like the boycotts and the Nuremberg laws before he tried more extreme acts of violence, ending up and culminating in the extermination camps. For instance, Daubowitz talks about there had never been any ideological deviation or wavering. In the end, only the question of opportunity mattered, and that opportunity came during World War II. Now, that is quite an extreme intentionalist argument. You could also decide that you fall more on the side of moderate intentionists, which is where they resist the idea of this long-term plan. But they do believe that Hitler was at the centre of the policy, and they believe that he probably had some sort of strategy, but not that it was this fixed gradualist policy, not necessarily that he, envisaged it ending in, something like the extermination camps. So essentially, the intentionist argument is talking about Hitler being absolutely crucial, and that generally there is some sort of plan right from the beginning of the Nazis coming to power. So the structuralists or the functionists then, they believe that there wasn't a plan from the outset. They talk, for instance, one historian talks about that the road to Auschwitz was a twisted one and was not the product of a grand design, but instead the result of the chaotic nature of the regime, that basically decisions were just made ad hoc. They believe as well that you can't stress the responsibility of one person more than others. They believe that the moral responsibility for the final solution is much wider than Hitler and should include the apparatus of the regime and also groups as well like the functionaries. More extreme instructionists believed that Nazi leadership didn't provide the initiative, but actually people like Goldhagen argue that Hitler had a lot of willing executioners and that anti-Semitic views were quite widespread. But that's a very extreme example. Browning disagrees with Goldhagen, but does say that ordinary people played a role and also blames more mundane factors as well, rather than just extreme anti-Semitism. So there's a sort of idea among obstructionists and functionists that it wasn't planned from the very beginning and it is wider than Hitler. Now, you don't have to decide exactly how you would define yourself, but I do want you to pause here to think about who you think's got the strongest argument. Do you see the Holocaust as being planned from the beginning, something that is consistent, something that is gradual? Do you believe that there was always a plan to murder Jews, but it's just that the policies hadn't yet been decided on? Or would you argue that this was not something that was planned, that was just something that was quite opportunistic, and something that was much wider than Hitler, much wider than the Nazi leadership, but actually was kind of propelled forward by other people, like functionaries or even the German people? I'm not going to go through this slide, but this is the unit summarised on one slide of information that you can pause and read through if you want to. It could be worth doing some consolidation activities and planning out some exam questions. There's going to be two on this video here. The first one says the systematic extermination of the Jews was the result of Hitler's personal obsessive anti-Semitism. So essentially, it's talking about Hitler was personally responsible for the final solution and the extermination of Jews. So pause the video here to try and do your own quick 5-minute plan. I'm just going to show you here what I would do if I was answering this question. I'd have a couple of paragraphs about Hitler and his role and supporting this argument that he was personally very obsessive in his anti-Semitism and that he had responsibility for the Holocaust. But then I would also have a few disagreeing paragraphs that contradict that statement. Consolidate your knowledge by looking at this exam plan as well. So one about continuity in Hitler's policy. So there was more continuity than change in Hitler's policies towards the Jews between 1938 and 1945. Have a go at planning this out, and then once you've done that, you can actually look at the A-level mark scheme to see some points that you could have included.